Let me show you one of the biggest reasons why your collar chokes from guard and other positions aren't working. So again, this is the things that I'm going to show you. They're like the biggest culprits to people's collar chokes not working, whether it be in full guard or wherever. This was the case for me, and it's the case for a lot of my students and a lot of people I've met. So if you're a white belt or a blue belt and you're having trouble getting your collar chokes to work, hopefully this helps you out. As always, it's my lovely assistant, Mr. Adam Wilson. Let's get started. Before we begin, let's talk about this idea of casting and reeling, right? So pretty much anytime you finish a choke, there's going to be this wrist action. This is one of the reasons why I see a lot of people, they don't finish their collar chokes, is because they get focused on the big pulls, the big prime movers of the body, right? The lats, they're pulling their upper back and everything else, but they forget the wrist. And it's really important because a lot of times that's what adds that little extra something, right? I'll also have another tip for you after that in just a second. So let's use the most basic choke you may learn in jiu-jitsu, which is like an X choke. We get our collar grips here and here. So I remember back in the day, I would pull, and it was like I would get here, and I'm pulling hard, and the person's maybe turning a little red, but not quite finishing, okay? So one of the things that I had to do is I had to really make sure I'm focused on turning these grips in, and then really flexing the wrist, okay? I can have, a good pull here, but flexing the wrist, that's it, right? That's a big important part. Turn this way slightly. Same thing for, like, let's say this grip here. So if we go here and do an over under for the X here, it's not just pulling. I'm gonna take this wrist. So this is the casting and the reeling. So I'm pulling in there. And again, what is that doing? That's securing the grips here, and it's pushing my wrists and my arms here into the arteries. It's the same thing even from, like, if we do like some back mount stuff. Go on the back mount here. Let's say if I do a back mount grip here, just like this, even like a bow and arrow, right? We could do an arrow. This is not a bow and arrow. This would be the worst bow and arrow ever. And be like, if this was what I showed you as a bow and arrow, you should not follow my channel. But assuming that we had a bow and arrow choke or any collar choke here, it's the same thing. We get those pulls going, and then we flex. Super important. That's one of the biggest reasons why I see a lot of people fail in their chokes. And that was honestly one of my big problems with the collar chokes back in the days. I did not add that little wrist flexion at the end of the choke. So once you get all the grips in, you're pulling, you either cast or you're reeling in. Cast or reeling in, that's one. Now the other one, and this is really important, is that you may not be holding long enough. So when we get a rear naked choke, the rear naked choke gets us to expect chokes to happen super quick, right? So if I go in here, I've got direct pressure on Adam's neck. So when I start to squeeze, he taps out really quickly, right? I mean, again, I can squeeze really tight because it's directly on there. Collar chokes don't always work that way. Sometimes they do, but not always. A lot of times there's going to be a little bit of a delay, and you've got to hold them. And so one of the things that you can do is hold them just a little bit longer than what you think. This is really clear. To land your back here. This is especially true if I'm doing like a basic cross collar choke here. Like if I go in here, boom, boom, and I get here to this grip here. This is one where I would get this sucker and I would put some pressure on it and everything else. I would do all the wrist flexion, but it just didn't seem to work. But then it was once I got here and I was holding for a little bit longer that it started to work. And again, that's the case with grips from the bottom of guard as well. And so those are two tips, and those are two big reasons that I see a lot of people like basically mess up with their collar chokes, or they miss their collar chokes, or they don't finish them. Is one, they don't focus on the wrist flexion at the end of the submission, and then two, they don't hold them long enough. So if you think that you were guilty of doing either one of those things, whether it be the casting, the reeling, not doing it, or the pulling the grip and holding it, then the next time you're rolling in the gym in the gi, in the pajamas, try to make sure you hold those grips for a little bit longer, and try to make sure you're adding that wrist flexion at the end, and hopefully that helps you guys with your collar chokes. So I'm finished. Adam?
Adam.